Morning once again. We are live from the Miami Book Fair, where 200,000 people come through during this time. It is the largest book fair in America, our 6th year of broadcasting live, and it's authors galore, and what we often refer to as the Interview Olympics. We're talking with authors about different books. Laurie Halse Anderson is our guest now, and following her multi-award-winning novel Chains in 2008, this well-researched sequel, Forged, set also during the Revolutionary War, and it's narrated by a young African-American. Laurie, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
How is it that you came to write specifically about this time in our history?
Well, I think the American Revolution is absolutely the most fascinating thing that's ever happened in America, and too often it's taught in such a way that children are put to sleep. There's nothing more exciting than a revolution.
You're an educator yourself?
No, sir. I'm a writer. I'm a storyteller.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is it that you take in that you hold kids' attention with this book?
I find primary sources that explain what really happened. And instead of pulling the camera back too far to look at things like, title of a battle and a date, I go into what were people's lives like? What were the sacrifices they were making to start a brand new country out of nothing?
Okay, talk about some of that, because we hear about the independence movement, the taxation issue, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the things that led up to the 4th of July 1776 and that declaration, but what kind of sacrifices were being made?
I think it's important to look up to what happened on December the 19th, 1777. That's when George Washington and about 12,000 teenage boys and men walked into Valley Forge, where there was nothing. That was going to be their winter encampment. The army at that point wasn't the middle-class men who fought at the beginning of the war. These were young soldiers who were fighting because of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. No country had ever promised its people before that everybody was created equal and everyone had the chance for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those boys spent 6 months pretty much hungry, exhausted, cold, and overworked, and the reason they did it is because they wanted a country that would honor them and give them a chance.
Do you take them into the battlefields in this story?
Book opens up in the Battle of Saratoga, which was actually pretty exciting because we won it. They didn't win a lot in the early days.
Pretty bloody scene, as I remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important to be honest with kids. Yeah, the books are written for children, so it's not as graphic as it would have been if I had written it for adults. But there were drummer boys on the field. There were 15-year-old soldiers back then, and they gave everything.
Was this a book that has an age range of, say, 8 to 14, or what's the age range?
I've been traveling the last 5 weeks around the country talking about the book and talking to educators and librarians, and everybody seems to be comfortable putting it in the hands of kids in 5th grade or 6th grade and up. There's a lot of school districts that are now taking out older books like Johnny Tremain and revisiting them and going, wow, this is not the way we want to teach this to our children. So any age group that would look at a book like Johnny Tremain, this is perfect for.
Is it too much to throw at kids that there were relationships between the revolutionaries and other countries? For example, we hired the Hessians to come in. The French had a problem with the British. Who took up sides between us and the British?
Well, everybody had choices to make, and sometimes people change their minds. The choice each family had to make is which side is going to be best for my family's chance at freedom, Team America or Team England. And we, Native American tribes had to choose. The Oneidas sided with the Patriots, the Mohawks sided with the British. And the French came in on the side of the Americans. The Hessians actually fought for the British.
They were hired.
They were hired. They were mercenary. Well, the British were mercenary. Those were professional soldiers, guys who enlisted for 20 years and fought for a paycheck. Our soldiers were boys and men fighting for their homeland, very different set of motivations.
And during the course of the Revolution, do we find that there are families who are right in the middle? Like in the Civil War, you had families divided, some with the Union, some with the Confederacy. Did that happen in the Revolution?
Absolutely. And there were some families who, some families in the Mid-Atlantic region, Pennsylvania, southern New York State, Maryland, they kind of had to go with which way the wind was blowing. If the British was were occupying their territory, and if they wanted to hold on to their land, well, they supported the British. And when the Patriots came in, they changed their tune. The next book in the trilogy is going to be set in the South. It's going to be called Ashes, and it looks at the war in Georgia and South Carolina. And that's where you really begin to see brother pitted against brother.
And this is in the Revolutionary War?
Yes, sir, in the Revolutionary War. It's really interesting, I'm glad I didn't have to live through it, but to see the parallels between that kind of conflict and then a few generations later you have the Civil War.
What are the issues that separate those two, so to give us a little taste of what's coming in Georgia and South Carolina that divides them? Is it the same issues that divided people? I mean, they figured we got better odds if we stay with England, or did it have to do with slavery, sharecropping? What was at issue?
The economy in the South was very different than the economy in the North. That's why although you had slavery in all American states, there's slaves in Boston, slaves in New York City, Philadelphia, Vermont, New Hampshire. Those slaveholdings tended to be small. In the South, that's where you have huge plantations, 600-800 people. And that economy was very closely tied to Great Britain. So some of the aristocrats in the South felt that their path lay with the British, because that's who they were trading with. But then you had the middle class tradesmen, people feeling like, no, these people are just taxing me. I don't have the advantage relationship that a plantation owner has. So they decided, I'm going to fight for the Americans.
Those areas are also largely rural at this time in our history. Am I correct?
Yes.
Especially West Georgia, West South Carolina.
Absolutely.
Are those people in touch with what's really happening?
Well, I think they're in touch with what's happening in their lives. It's really hard for us to imagine how long it took to communicate information from, this Boston down to South Carolina or England. Months would go by without knowing what was going on. And
I think the point I'm trying to get to is I get a sense that from what little I've read about it, in western South Carolina, in Georgia, there were many people who were running farms that said, what happens up in Boston, that's their business. Yeah. That's not what's going on down here. Am I right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that notion of creating a federal union of states where a federal, overarching sense of the nation would be in control, or that people should care about what happened in Boston if they're in South Carolina, that did not take a long time.
Laurie, I also read where there were some people who were resistant to break away because they said, that's fine. It's not great with England, right. But if we leave, the French are going to come in and take us, or the Spanish.
Or the Spanish.
Was that real? Was that a real fear?
And it's funny because now we tend to look, the conservative position back then was to stay with England. The revolutionaries, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, those were the rebels. They were, as a matter of fact, in the beginning of the war, that's what they called themselves, the rebels. We look upon them now as very conservative men because they laid the foundation for our country, but at the time they were overthrowing a government. It doesn't get any more radical than that.
Wow, sounds like a great idea. Why forged?
Forge
ahead, move ahead.
Forge ahead. Valley Forge is that's right there.
Was it referred to as Forge?
No, they referred to it as Valley Forge, but it was that was where the army was forged. The men and boys who marched in December were poor. They were young. A lot of them were new recruits. You have Baron von Steuben comes over from Prussia, and he uses that winter to really turn them into an organized, trained fighting force. The men who marched out in June and then went to the Battle of Monmouth, they were ready to take on the British.
This is not funny, but it is kind of funny. The Americans fought in the Revolution in a far different manner than the British did. The British in their bright red, I still remember reading about it in Boston. They were in formation, they would march out, and they were sitting ducks because the Americans are hiding behind rocks and trees, and they're picking them off. You would have thought after the first time this happened, a light would have gone off in their head saying, maybe this doesn't work. Apparently, they continued to do this for a little while.
Well, actually, in the beginning of the war, because George Washington had been a British soldier in the French and Indian War, he was with, I think, General Braddock, and he wanted his army to fight like the British army. So he wanted to use those same European traditional methods of, line up on a battlefield and just shoot at each other. But Washington very quickly figured out that wouldn't work. So he shifted to what we would now call guerrilla tactics. It's so baffling for us to look back on the British letters and say, why didn't you do that? But they were so hidebound by their traditions that they couldn't see their way clear.
Finally, this era, we all know who Benedict Arnold was and why he became such a fixture in American history. Were there other people who said, maybe Washington doesn't have it together? Do we know, and do we learn from your books, if there were other people who thought maybe this isn't the right way.
Well, as a matter of fact, at Valley Forge, there was a lot of political backstabbing going on. There was a couple of men who felt that Washington was leading them down the wrong path. Some other generals tried to directly communicate with Congress and start some rumors going around. Things haven't changed at all. But Washington, I think, was so beloved by the men, and the officers who stayed with the army so supported him that everybody was going to march with him.
Fascinating. I'm always interested in this history, and this is a great opportunity for the youth of this country to read in a very discernible and understandable way how the American Revolution came to. The narrator is an African American, am I correct?
Yep, he's a runaway slave. His name is Corzon. One of the things that I wanted to look at in this series of books is the fact that there was slavery in the North. And when the American Revolution was fought, it was not fought for people of color. But despite that, thousands and thousands of African American men fought for the Patriots. Others chose to fight for the British. This war was the last time our army was integrated until the Korean War. Black men and white men serving together, side by side, fighting for that promise of freedom.
Laurie Halse Anderson, author of the book Forged, our guest today on Bookmark Live from Miami. A pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Miami.